How's your hammer, everybody? I'm PTDevil, and welcome to another episode of The Deck Doctors. In this series, we'll be looking at some of the most unplayable archetypes in the whole game, figuring out why they're so bad, and designing some new support to help make them playable. The process we'll be using is examining what it is they do, diagnosing what their problems are, and prescribing a treatment for them to be less awful. With all that said, let's get to the video. Anyone who's met me knows I have a personal beef with Burning Abyss. If you were to ask me, I would say that BA is a degenerate, unfair archetype literally coming from the depths of Satan's anus that has no objective reason to exist. However, since I was asked to do this review and I was forced to take the rage blinders off, I'm willing to admit that they are not great. Most of my grievances come from me not knowing how the modern game worked back when I picked it up again, which just so happened to be in the middle of their prime meta relevance. And while I have to give them credit for being able to adapt and remain functional in the face of power creep, nowadays in a format where we have stuff like Orcus, Salamangrates, and motherfuckers, being functional is not nearly enough anymore. So for the sake of integrity and out of an obligation to honor the request of a friend, I will swallow my pride and try to improve Burning Abyss. We start off the review with Rubik, Malebranche of the Burning Abyss. Like all Pringles in the archetype, it's a level 3 Dark Fiend, this one with 100 attack and 2100 defense, and the following effect. If you control a monster that is not a Burning Abyss monster, destroy this card. Cannot be used as synchro material except for the synchro summon of a Burning Abyss synchro monster. If you control no spell or trap cards, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only use this effect of Rubik, Malebranche of the Burning Abyss once per turn. The two actual effects on this card, those being the self-destructing if you dare control a non-archetypal monster, and the special summoning from the hand if you don't have any spell or traps, are present and accounted for on all other Pringles of the archetype as well, setting up the theme for the archetype relying heavily on using their monsters in vast quantities. In addition to this, they also have a floating effect when they're sent to the graveyard that can be used in place of the special summoning effect, but unfortunately someone seemed to have forgotten to tell Rubicante that, since the only thing separating him from the rest of his brethren is being a tuner, with the restriction that he can only be used as material for a certain underwhelming level 6 synchro that we'll get into later. Red-faced terror my ass. I would normally dismiss garbage like this up front, but the special summoning condition, as well as how the deck works in general, is more than enough on its own to consider running a copy or two for the sake of an extra body on board. Just be wary of needlessly blowing him up. Next up is Skarm, Malebranche of the Burning Abyss. He's got 800 attack and 2000 defense, and his floating effect lets you search a level 3 Dark Fiend during the end phase. A gentle reminder, both this effect and the summoning effect are a hard one per turn, once per turn deal. For a card based off of Skarmillion, the Troublemaker, this one is kinda slow at first glance. Fortunately, it at least makes up for it by being able to search literally any level 3 Dark Fiend, including Tour Guide of the Underworld, whose synergy with the deck was so great it led to her premature hit on the ban list to 1 copy. This can also be sent to the graveyard during the opponent's turn via one of their Xyz monsters, allowing you to search a card and use it almost immediately. Run 3 copies since this is the best searcher they got right now with all the hits they took on the ban list. The next monster is Graf, Malebranche of the Burning Abyss. He's got 1000 attack and 1500 defense, and his floating effect lets you special summon a Burning Abyss monster from your deck except for himself. Not that he can do that anyway since he's currently limited to 1, but I at least appreciate the thought. Nevertheless, this kind of effect is one that will likely never get power crept, since special summoning from the deck is an absolutely busted mechanic in just about any deck. This means in a Burning Abyss deck, you can pretty much activate any floating effect you want at any given time, especially if you happen to control a non-Burning Abyss monster so that whatever you summon instantly destroys itself. It's kind of like an I scratch your back, you scratch mine deal. Fitting for a monster based off of Graffiacane, the dog scratcher, but I digress. Anyway, you run the 1 copy you can, but if he ever comes down the list, which I don't believe for a second, you immediately bump that shit up. You know, since all the main deck monsters are Malebranche of the Burning Abyss, I'm just gonna go ahead and stop mentioning that and just read out their original names along with their origins. So here's Farfarello the Goblin.
Goblin ka?
He's got 1000 attack and 1900 defense, and his floating effect lets you banish a targeted monster on the field until the end phase. As far as simple, quick spot removal goes, this is easily the best they got. While it does target and is only temporary, it can at least help remove problem monsters for a turn to allow you to keep playing through your combo and build a board. Alternatively, you can also detach him on the opponent's turn with one of their Xyz monsters in order to stop their plays before they can even happen. Worst case scenario, it can bait out a negate, which will let you actually play in most cases, which is a rarity nowadays. Run 3 Farfa, it'll surely save your ass more often than not. Next up is Dragignazzo, the big nasty dragon, and oh how I wish it were nearly as awesome as that in Origin makes it sound. It's got 1100 attack and 900 defense, and his floating effect lets you top deck a Burning Abyss card from your deck. Not only does the big nasty dragon have pathetic stats even for a level 3, but his effect is also completely outclassed by his younger brother, Scarm. I don't think I need to explain why searching is infinitely preferable to top decking, even though they're both about the same level of speed. And while this does get additional utility in being able to top deck their ritual monster as well as their spells and traps, the most viable builds of the deck rely on them not having spells and traps in the first place. As a result, you will elect to ignore them solely for what they are as opposed to what they do. I hope you appreciate that sentence because I'm going to be repeating it a lot in this review. As for Dragig himself, you can run a copy of him for the same reasons why you'd run Rubik, for the sole purpose of having an extra body on board. Next up is Alicino, the Harlequin.
Are you out of your mind? Yeah.
He's got 1200 attack and no defense, and his floating effect lets you negate the effects of a targeted monster on the field until the end of the turn. If Dragig is a worse Scarm, then this thing is a shitty Farfa. As I've mentioned before, targeting negation kinda defeats the purpose of negation, since most monsters you would want to negate the effects of have targeting immunity in the first place. Furthermore, you'll still need to invest additional resources to get rid of the target monster anyway, since Alich doesn't actually remove anything from the field on its own. Still, it's a free body, and it can help out in some niche situations, so feel free to run 1 or 2. The next monster is Libicocho, the Libyan Hothead. Hey, don't look at me. Inferno was written in the early 1300s, and they weren't exactly known for their political correctness back then. Anyway, he's got 1300 attack and 700 defense, and his floating effect lets you special summon a level 3 Dark Fiend from your hand, but its effects are negated. Needless to say, the most ideal targets for this effect are the Burning Abyss monsters themselves, since the effect negation actually allows them to coexist with non-archetypal monsters to be used as material. If you don't happen to have any in your hand, then Fiendish Rhino Warrior can also serve as a suitable replacement. Not quite 3-off worthy, but 2 Libic should be fine. Next up is Calcabrina, the Grace Stomper. Good question on what that's supposed to mean, because not even I know. I can't even come up with a fan theory of what that could possibly be a reference to. He's got 1400 attack and no defense, and his floating effect lets you bounce a targeted set spell trap on the field. Normally, this sort of effect would be relegated exclusively to the side deck, since its usefulness is extremely limited to certain matchups. However, if Rubik, Dragig, and Alich can be used as a one-off, then running a copy of this in the main deck will be perfectly fine for a free body, even in a poor matchup. The next monster is Cagnazzo, the Nasty Dog. No relation to Graffiacane. 1500 attack, 300 defense, and a floating effect to mill a Burning Abyss spell trap. To cut it some slack, there is at least one spell trap with a really good graveyard effect, so it's not like this effect comes completely out of nowhere. But the most reliable builds of the deck rely on them not having spells and traps in the first place. As a result, you will elect to ignore it for what it is as opposed to what it does. As for this bitch, again, just run 1 copy for the free body. And that last statement wasn't a figure of speech either. Cagna literally means bitch in Italian. So then this means that this is actually a female demon. Ooh, Impressive. Really progressive of Hell to include gender equality in its Malabranch forces during the early 14th century. Their other limited Pringle is Seriato, the Wild Hog, named so because he lets you go hog wild on your entire board. Beefy, 1600 attack and 1200 defense, and his floating effect lets you special summon a Burning Abyss monster from your graveyard other than itself. Again, not really an effect that is very susceptible to power creep. While it does require a bit more setup as compared to Graft, it also means that you can revive most of the extra deck monsters, save for one or two. One in particular is useful for going into further extra deck plays by using it as Exceed material straight out of the box. Again, it's limited to one, but on the off chance that it ever comes off, you immediately bump that shit up. The last Pringle is Barbarachia, the Curly Beard. I feel like the only one who needs a barber around here is him. A massive 1700 attack and 1000 defense for a level 3, and his floating effect lets you banish up to 3 other targeted Burning Abyss monsters from your graveyard and burn the opponent for 300 for each of them. At first glance, this seems a bit underwhelming due to only being mediocre burn damage. However, more modern builds rely on using Orbital Hydrolander as a beatdown/mill option. Therefore, the graveyard banishing part of this effect helps set up the graveyard to allow you to summon it and use its effect by removing duplicate BAs from your GY. Then you can set up an OTK that would be super OP, and then it would become GG, and your opponent would get PO'd and then KO you with a BFG and get DQ'd while you get carted off to the MD. God, I love abbreviations. Anyway, run 2 or 3 of these. The last main deck monster is Malakota, Netherlord of the Burning Abyss. He's a level 6 ritual monster with 2700 attack and 2200 defense, and you can ritual summon this card with Good and Evil in the Burning Abyss. Must be ritual summoned and cannot be special summoned by other ways. Once per turn during either player's turn, you can send one Burning Abyss monster from your hand to the graveyard, then target one face-up monster your opponent controls. Until the end of this turn, that target loses attack and defense equal to the attack and defense of the Burning Abyss monster sent to the graveyard this way. If this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can target one card on the field, send it to the graveyard. Good and Evil in the Burning Abyss is a standard ritual spell that, except the turn it was sent there, you can banish from your graveyard and send a Burning Abyss monster from your hand to the graveyard to add a Burning Abyss monster from your deck to your hand. You can only use this effect of Good and Evil in the Burning Abyss once per turn. Contrary to popular belief, this isn't Satan, but rather one of the few characters whose name Konami didn't touch. He's also supposed to be one of the Malabranch, known as the Evil Tail, though he is also the leader of the Malabranch, so there is some merit to his status here. Even still, I'm gonna say I'm playing Malakota's advocate and say that this is really well designed for his own archetype. The quick effect to discard a BA can be used to disrupt the opponent's plays by triggering the effects of Alich and Farfa during their turn. The floating effect into non-destruction removal can be handy and plays well into the theme of the overall archetype. And the graveyard effect of the ritual spell is one of the best archetypal searching effect I've ever seen for how well it plays with being able to trigger the effects of other BA monsters. But the most reliable builds of the deck rely on them not having spells and traps in the first place. As a result, you will elect to ignore them for what they are as opposed to what they do. Going out of order for a bit, we'll start the extra deck discussion with Dante, Traveler of the Burning Abyss, based off of Dante Alighieri, the author and main character of Inferno. I would comment on this, but I also wrote an entire novel in the second person's perspective just to prove that I could, so I don't really have room to complain. Anyway, he's a rank 3 light warrior Xyz with 1000 attack and 2500 defense, requires 2 level 3 monsters and material, and has the following effect. Once per turn, you can detach one material from this card and choose a number from 1 to 3, then send that many cards from the top of your deck to the graveyard. Until the end of this turn, this card gains 500 attack for each card sent to the graveyard this way. If this card attacks, it is changed to defense position at the end of the battle phase. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can target one Burning Abyss card in your graveyard except this card, add it to your hand. Needless to say, this is a really good card for just about any deck that can make him. I wouldn't say it's necessarily pot G grade worthy since BAs can't really function without him, but any deck that can make a rank 3 and benefit from milling 3 cards will have a field day with this thing. Additionally, even with splashing him into another deck, the floating effect can be used to recycle another copy of himself to be reused. Make sure to run at least 2 of these for this reason exactly. Funnily enough, this isn't the only Dante monster either, since the next monster is Dante, Pilgrim of the Burning Abyss. It's a level 9 Light Fairy fusion monster with 2800 attack and 2500 defense. Requires 3 Burning Abyss monsters with different names as material. Must be fusion summoned and cannot be special summoned by other ways. Cannot be targeted by an opponent's card effects. Once per turn during either player's turn, you can send 1 Burning Abyss card from your hand to the graveyard, draw 1 card. If this card is destroyed by battle and sent to the graveyard, or if this card you control is sent to your graveyard by an opponent's card effect, you can send 1 random card in your opponent's hand to the graveyard. I know that you may be expecting me to say something all along the lines of, the most reliable builds of this deck rely on them not having spells and traps in the first place, as a result you will elect to ignore it for what it is as opposed to what it does. However, this deck does have a way of cheesing this thing out without fusion summoning it, so you won't need a fusion spell to get this guy out. With that in mind, this easily becomes the best boss monster of the deck, what with the quick effect draw that triggers other BA effects, targeting immunity, and floating into a random discard upon leaving the field. The card that brings this out is currently also limited, so you won't need to run more than 1, but that 1 is more than enough in most cases. The next monster is Virgil, Rockstar of the Burning Abyss, based off the ancient Roman poet whom Dante admired and served as his guide through the deepest depths of hell. What a nice role model. Anyway, he's a level 6 light spellcaster synchro with 2500 attack and 1000 defense, is completely generic, but you can only control 1 Virgil, Rockstar of the Burning Abyss. Once per turn, you can discard 1 Burning Abyss card, then target 1 card your opponent controls or in their graveyard, shuffle it into the deck. If this card on the field is destroyed by battle or card effect and sent to the graveyard, you can draw 1 card. You can only use this effect of Virgil, Rockstar of the Burning Abyss once per turn. Despite having one of the most powerful forms of removal and floating effects in the game, upon further inspection this one is kind of underwhelming. Remember, the only tuner in this archetype is Rubik, so you'll need a very specific monster to summon him in most cases. Unlike the other boss monsters, his discard effect isn't a quick effect, so there's little he can do aside from targeting spot removal, even if it is spinning removal. And the restriction of only being able to control 1 is actually mildly annoying, funnily enough, considering it would otherwise make for a decent rank 6 fodder. Running 1 couldn't hurt, but I wouldn't go out of my way to make it. The next monster, and I'm going to be pronouncing this one the way it's supposed to be pronounced, as in the way it's pronounced in the Italian dialect Dante spoke in, is Beatrice, Lady of the Eternal. She's a rank 6 light fairy Xyz with 2500 attack and 2800 defense. Requires 2 level 6 monsters, but you can also Xyz summon this card by sending 1 Burning Abyss monster from your hand to the graveyard, then using 1 Dante monster you control as the Xyz material. Xyz materials attached to that monster also become Xyz materials on this card. If summoned this way, the following effect cannot be activated this turn. Once per turn during either player's turn, you can detach 1 Xyz material from this card, send 1 card from your deck to the graveyard. If this card in your possession is destroyed by your opponent's card, by battle or card effect, and sent to your graveyard, you can special summon 1 Burning Abyss monster from your extra deck, ignoring its summoning conditions. This is the last limited card in the archetype, and also why nobody who wants to run Pilgrim even bothers with fusion summoning. Not only does she have an easy to use alternate summoning condition and an excellent floating effect going into a bigger boss monster, but the regular effect is also one of the best ones in the archetype, a quick effect Foolish Burial. I can think of several archetypes just off the top of my head who would kill to have this kind of effect present somewhere on the deck, let alone a monster as awesome as this one. Run this thing, always keep it handy, don't ever think about leaving the house without her. The last monster is Cherubini, Ebon Angel of the Burning Abyss, based on some random non-entity mentioned in passing by a throwaway character shoehorned into the later part of the poem. Why that is, we'll get into that detail later. Anyway, it's a Link 2 Dark Fairy with a whopping 500 attack and arrows pointing bottom left and bottom right. It requires 2 level 3 monsters as material and has the following effect. Monsters this card points to cannot be destroyed by card effects. If this card on the field would be destroyed by battle or an opponent's card effect, you can send one other card you control to the graveyard instead. You can send 1 level 3 monster from your deck to the graveyard, then target 1 Burning Abyss monster on the field. It gains attack and defense equal to that sent monster's attack and defense until the end of the turn. You can only use this effect of Cherubini, Ebon Angel, the Burning Abyss once per turn. Well, I know that they desperately needed a Link monster in the archetype, and this one is okay. The protection for monsters it points to is helpful, if a little counterintuitive at some points. The self-protection is arguably the best part about it, since it lets you control which floating effects go off in place of losing an important monster. And the mill effect, while fundamentally important and generic enough to be extremely awesome, does lose a lot of points by having the attack boost not last through the opponent's turn, turning this monster's mere 500 attack points into a huge liability. Even with the awesome protection, your opponent is going to be effectively smacking you in the face directly, repeatedly, so you better win on the turn you summon him, because otherwise you're done. Still, for what it's worth, it's still a good card, so be sure to run 1 or 2. And now, we move on to the spell and trap lineup. We start off with our archetypal fusion spell, the Terminus of the Burning Abyss. The first effect is just an archetypal polymerization, but it also has a graveyard effect where, except the turn it was sent there, you can banish it from the graveyard to buff a targeted BA monster by 800 until the end of the opponent's next turn. Not only is the attack boost incredibly underwhelming from the perspective of today's metagame, but as we've mentioned before, its entire existence is made irrelevant due to the existence of Beatrice. Plus, you know, the most reliable builds of the deck rely on them not having spells and traps in the first place. As a result, you will elect to ignore it for what it is as opposed to what it does. Next up is the trap card, the Traveler and the Burning Abyss. Target any number of Burning Abyss monsters in your graveyard that were sent there this turn, special summon them in defense position. You can only activate 1, the Traveler and the Burning Abyss per turn. If I can defend Senior Silver Ninja for being an archetypal soul charge, then I have to give this one at least some slack. While not as immediately useful due to it being a trap card that needs setup to work, if your deck is working like it should be live at any given moment. However, unless your board is either entirely empty or pure BA, you're not likely to benefit from this effect, given how you've already most likely used at least one of those monsters' effects by that point. Also, the most reliable builds of the deck rely on them not having spells and traps in the first place. As a result, you'll elect to ignore it for what it is as opposed to what it does. And the last card is Fire Lake of the Burning Abyss. Send 2 face-up Burning Abyss monsters you control to the graveyard, then target up to 3 cards on the field, destroy those targets. Yeah, whatever, it's slow, requires a lot of setup, and it targets, which dampens any utility it could have. But how could I not love a better Icarus attack? Send 2 monsters to pop 3 of any card is a really good effect regardless of the downsides I mentioned. Also, I don't think I need to mention how it'll trigger the floating effects of whatever you said, barring the boss monsters for whatever reason. However, the most reliable builds of the deck rely on them not having spells and traps in the first place. As a result, you will elect to ignore it for what it is as opposed to what it does. Here's a basic build of how BAs would work in today's metagame. Feel free to experiment with whatever other monster-heavy engines you want. Now personally, I would never actually want to improve on Burning Abyss, but it's a thing I gotta do, so here goes. First of all, a way to blanketly remove the self-destruction handicap on the Pringles could definitely help. Most of what they have for this utility are unsearchable non-archetypal monsters that have limited success at best with it. There is some benefit to blowing them up, so a way to turn it off would also be needed, but in general it does much more harm than good. A way to get access to the spell and trap lineup, or at the very least the effects they provide without actually having to use them, would be greatly appreciated as well. They actually have decent spell and trap support, but it also happens to conflict with the playstyle of the deck solely by being spells and traps. I would keep going with this review, but there's actually not that much that the deck needs to be top tier again, so I'm just gonna go ahead and stop right there and preserve my sanity for the next part. And now we come to the prescription, but unlike entities, which were a huge vein of untapped potential, Konami really seems to have mined this source dry, as all the major characters and elements in Inferno are present and accounted for at least once in the archetype. Well, except for one. However, given Konami's legendary insistence on censorship, it's highly unlikely that they'll adapt him into the archetype to begin with. Or, if they do, we all know it's just going to end up being Santa Claus 2, and nobody wants that. So again, as far as Inferno is concerned, there isn't really anything left to adapt. However, therein lies the answer to this conundrum. You see, as my fellow English majors would know, Inferno is just one part of a much larger trilogy known collectively as the Divine Comedy. The other two parts are Purgatorio, which chronicles Dante's travels through Limbo on his way to heaven, and Paradiso, which is his journey through said heaven. I would like to emphasize the latter of the two due to the presence of Beatrice, because while she is mentioned several times in the preceding books, she never actually appears until Paradiso, where she takes over Virgil's role in acting as Dante's guide through the 9 circles of heaven. Yeah, the structures of these poems are almost identical in how they all take place in 9 distinct spheres and an end goal of bringing to a total 10. But anyways, I'm getting sidetracked. Wait, no, that's not right, since explaining the mythos is part of my job description. I'm spending too much time on the premise. Yeah, let's go with that. Anyway, in light of this new connection, I believe that the best option here is to create a new sub-archetype to support VAs, based on major characters from the Paradiso section of the Divine Comedy, which I will hereby dub the Eternal. To introduce this new archetype, let's start off with Braba, Wise Soul of the Eternal. Like all his brethren, he's a level 3 light fairy based on one of the wise souls Dante met in the 4th circle of heaven, whose bright wisdom illuminates the earth, the 4th circle being the sun after all. This one in particular is based on Seeger of Brabant, a 13th century philosopher who was an important proponent in Avarism, but in this archetype, he's a tuner with 1700 attack and 0 defense and the following effect. Negate the effects of all level 3 Burning Abyss monsters on the field. When using this card as a Synchro Material monster, you can use one Burning Abyss monster in your hand as the other Synchro Material monster. If you have no spell or trap cards in your graveyard, you can special summon this card from your hand. You can only use this effect of Bravo Wise Soul of the Eternal once per turn. Much like the last tuner we talked about, he sets up the archetype by setting up the 2 common effects shared by his brethren. The negation of the level 3 BA's self-destruction effects, and the special summoning itself from the hand if you have no spells and traps in the graveyard. Not only does it help with the consistency of BAs by keeping them on the field to use them as material, but it also doubles down on the Monster Mash builds by requiring both the field and graveyard to be clear of spell traps for maximum efficiency. It also has a synchro summoning effect, but rather than a restriction, it's a huge boon to be able to synchro summon using a BA in your hand as material. Doing this does restrict you to only being able to summon level 6 synchros this way, but that could be a big help in being easily able to summon Virgil regularly while still getting the effect of the BA you sent as material. Between the 2 tuners of this archetype, this is easily the better one to run. Now for a speed run, let's go ahead and cover half of the new support cards all at once. The reason why will soon become painfully obvious. Sanvik, Bede, Seville, Bothi, Orosi, and Dennis, Wise Souls of the Eternal, are based on Richard of St. Victor, Bede, Isidore of Seville, Boethius, Orosius, and Dionysius the Areopagite, respectively. They all have the same negation and special summoning effects as Braba, with an additional effect which requires you to send at least them from the field to the graveyard to activate. Sanvik lets you send it and 2 BAs to special summon a Burning Abyss fusion monster as a fusion summon. Bede lets you send it to target a BA you control and give it 800 attack. Seville lets you send it and 1 BA to special summon a Burning Abyss ritual monster from your hand or graveyard as a ritual summon. Bothi lets you send it from the field and a Burning Abyss from your hand to search out a BA from your deck. Orosi lets you send it to special summon any number of BAs from your graveyard that were sent there this turn. And Dennis lets you send it and 2 BAs to target and destroy up to 3 cards on the field. Do these effects seem familiar to any of you? Well, if they do, that might be because they're all based on the exact same effects as the spell and trap support. Like I said, their spell and traps are actually really good, but it's just the fact of them being spells and traps that's counterintuitive to how the deck is supposed to function now. Sandvik might be a tad unnecessary given the existence of Beatrice, but the others have a lot of potential behind them. Bede's attack gain is permanent, which can lessen some of the downsides of Cherubini. Seville makes running Malakota viable. Bothie gives you access to the best effect in the entire archetype. Orosi is an archetypal soul charge, and Dennis is a better Icarus attack. Ratios may vary depending on your build, but Bothie and Orosi might be the ones worth maxing out on. While this is technically a separate archetype from the others, we'll need a bit of consistency for this set as well. But rather than trying to reinvent the wheel, I decided to look to existing support for inspiration. As such, it's time for another speed round. Solemn, Lombard, Gradia, Magna, and Aquina, Wise Souls of the Eternal, are based on King Solomon, Peter Lombard, Gradian, Albertus Magnus, and Thomas Aquinas, respectively. Solemn lets you send it to search an Eternal monster other than himself. Lombard lets you send it to special summon an Eternal monster from the graveyard other than himself. Gradia lets you special summon an Eternal from your deck other than himself. Magna lets you special summon an Eternal from your hand other than himself. And Aquina lets you shuffle up to 5 BAs and or Eternals into the deck and gain 300 life points for each. Sharp-eyed viewers may know something familiar about these as well, and that's because they're variations on some of the better BA monsters. Solemn is a faster archetypal Skarm, Lombard is an archetypal Seer, Gradia is an archetypal Graph, Magna is an archetypal Libic, and Aquina is just a straight upgrade of Barber in terms of how the deck uses it. Definitely consider running a few of each of these if you want to be as consistent as possible. The last card is a new Dante boss monster, this being Dante, Enlightened of the Eternal Burning Abyss. He's a level 9 Light Fairy Synchro with 3000 attack and 2800 defense, requires 1 tuner and 2 non-tuner Burning Abyss monsters, and it must be synchro summoned. Cannot be targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects. Quick effect, you can send 1 Burning Abyss monster from your hand to the graveyard, add 1 Eternal monster to your hand that is banished or in the graveyard. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 Burning Abyss or Eternal monster from your deck or graveyard. You can only use each effect of Dante, Enlightened of the Eternal Burning Abyss, once per turn. A completely expected thing to note, you won't be synchro summoning this. He's 1 material too high to be cheesed out with Braba, so if you'll want to summon him properly, you'll need to do so the hard way by getting out a tuner and 2 non-tuner BAs without having them blow up. Not impossible to do, especially with Orosi, but it's still more work than it's worth. No, you're going to want to summon this thing off of Beatrice's floating effect more often than not, because his own floating effect lets you float back into her if need be. As for the card's own merits, it's a 3k beater with targeting and destruction immunity that can recycle Eternal monsters while simultaneously setting up BA monster effects. I honestly don't know what more the deck could want from this. Perfectly fine at any value from 1 to 3. And that's all the support that I got. Just my luck that this had to be the first archetype I had to design support for entirely on my own since Entities. Maybe I'll be able to get some more help for these by the time the next video goes up in the form of Patreons. I don't like Burning Abyss. I like their artworks and their lore, and that's about as far as it goes. Despite them being somewhat neutered since their prime, along with having decks I now despise far more than them, I still have a lot of bad blood when it comes to this deck, unfortunately. But at the very least, I can take pride in being able to set aside my hatred and design this new support the best I could while taking their current best build into consideration. With this new wave of support, I can safely say that Burning Abyss is capable of being just as powerful as it was back in its prime, and that is exactly why I am quitting the game forever. Thank you guys so much for watching. This was an ordeal in more ways than one, but at least I was finally able to produce a video with a reasonable length. Hopefully I can keep this pattern going for the next installment. But anyway, thank you guys for watching. Until next time, don't get run over, and I'll see you guys later.